It was a Tuesday, I think. I had the late shift and the night was dragging on like usual. Around 11:30 p.m., just as I was hoping to wrap things up, the order came in. A large pepperoni pizza, extra cheese, nothing too special. But the delivery address made me do a double take. It was out of town, some old farmhouse about 15 miles away from the city. I'd never delivered out there before, but I figured maybe someone had just moved in or something. The place didn't even have a name on the map, just a pin in the middle of nowhere. I punched the address into my GPS and headed out. The drive was longer than I expected and the roads kept getting narrower and darker. I passed by nothing but fields and trees for miles. No houses, no streetlights, just the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the blackness. It started to feel like I was the only person left on Earth. Eventually I turned onto this dirt road that led straight into the woods. The GPS said I was getting close, but I couldn't see anything up ahead. After a few more minutes I finally spotted the house. Well, it was more of a farmhouse. Old, run down, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. There were no lights on, and I started wondering if I had the wrong address, but I was sure I'd followed the directions right. I pulled up in front of the house and left the car running. The whole place felt dead. Not a single sound, no wind, no crickets, nothing. It was eerie, like the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. I grabbed the pizza and walked up to the front door, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. The doorbell didn't work, so I knocked. My knuckles barely touched the wood when the door creaked open on its own. I froze, my hand still raised mid-knock. There was a dim light coming from somewhere inside, just enough to make out the shadow of a man standing in the doorway. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he looked off. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he was hunched over like he'd been through something rough. I wondered if he was homeless or something. "Pizza's here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't say a word. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. I could feel my skin crawling under his gaze. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly reached out and took the pizza box from my hands. I waited for him to pay, but he just turned and shuffled back into the house, leaving the door open behind him. Sir?" I called after him, but he was already gone. I didn't want to go inside, but I also didn't want to leave without getting paid. My boss would kill me if I just gave away a pizza for free. I hesitated on the doorstep, peering into the dark hallway beyond. The air smelled wrong. I couldn't place it at first, but then it hit me. It was the smell of decay, like something had been rotting in there for days. My stomach churned and I almost turned around and left right then. But something made me step inside. Maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity. I don't know. I walked a few steps into the hallway calling out, "Hey, I need to get paid!" My voice echoed through the empty house, but there was no response. The dim light I'd seen earlier was coming from a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar and I could hear something, a faint rustling like someone moving around in there. I should have left. I should have just cut my losses and gotten out of there. But I didn't. I kept walking, telling myself I'd just peek inside, grab my money and leave. The closer I got to that room, the stronger the smell became. It was overpowering, like something was seriously wrong in there. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated. My hand was shaking as I pushed it open a little more. Inside, the room was a mess. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the man. He was sitting in a chair facing away from me, hunched over like before, his back rising and falling with shallow breaths. "Sir?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I need the payment for the pizza." He didn't move. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it, the source of the smell. There was something on the floor beside him, covered by a dirty sheet. It was stained dark, and the smell was strongest there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly the man's head jerked up and he turned to look at me. His face was pale, almost gray, with deep, sunken eyes that stared right through me. He smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was twisted, like he was forcing his face into an expression it didn't want to make. "You're too late," he rasped. His voice was dry, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Too late for what?" I asked, my heart pounding. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached down and pulled the sheet away, revealing what was underneath. I barely had time to register what I was looking at before the nausea hit me. It was a body, a woman's body, decomposing and half-eaten by whatever had been in that house with her. Her eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling in a frozen look of terror. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. The man just sat there, watching me with that twisted smile like he was waiting for me to react. "What the hell is this?" I gasped, my voice shaking. "Who are you?" But he didn't answer. He just kept smiling, his eyes locked onto mine. I felt like I was trapped in that room, unable to move, unable to look away from his stare. Then there was a loud bang from somewhere in the house, like a door slamming shut. It jolted me out of my paralysis, and I turned and bolted for the front door. I didn't look back, didn't care about the money anymore. I just ran. I jumped into my car and sped down that dirt road like my life depended on it. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the wheel steady. I don't even remember how I got back to town, but I must have been driving on autopilot, my mind completely blank except for the image of that decomposing body and the man's twisted smile. When I finally made it back to the pizza shop, I just sat in the car for a while, trying to calm down. My boss came out, probably wondering why I'd been gone so long. He asked me if everything was okay, but I couldn't tell him what had happened. I just said there was some trouble with the delivery and that I'd explain later. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, that smile. I started questioning myself, wondering if it had really happened or if my mind had just played some sick trick on me. But the smell, the sight of that body, it was too real to be a hallucination. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind. I went back to work, did my deliveries, and tried to act like everything was normal. But then, a couple of days later, I saw something on the news that made my blood run cold. They were talking about a body found in an old farmhouse just outside of town. The reporter said it had been there for weeks, maybe even months. The police were investigating it as a homicide, but no one knew how long the person had been dead before they were discovered. I knew it was the same house, the same room, the same body. But here's the thing that's been keeping me up at night. The news report said the house had been abandoned for years. No one had lived there for a long time, and the place was supposed to be empty. So who the hell was the man I saw, and how did he get that pizza? I've been delivering pizzas for about 2 years now. The job's usually pretty simple. Drive to the address, drop off the pizza, and collect the cash or card payment. Most of my shifts are at night, which I actually prefer. There's something peaceful about the quiet streets when most people are tucked away in their homes. It was a Thursday night around 11:30 p.m. We're usually not that busy at that time, but the phone rang with an order. The customer wanted a large pepperoni pizza, extra cheese. I glanced at the delivery address, 128 Crestview Road. I didn't recognize the address, but it wasn't too far, maybe 15 minutes out of town. It was kind of in the middle of nowhere though. I figured it might be some older guy living out there by himself, maybe someone who doesn't like being around people. You get that sometimes. Anyway, I prepped the pizza, boxed it up, and headed out. The drive started off normal. I passed the usual spots, the 24-hour gas station, the late-night diner with only a couple of cars in the lot, and then, as I got further out, fewer and fewer houses. The streetlights became less frequent too, until eventually I was driving in almost complete darkness. My GPS told me to turn down a narrow, unpaved road. As I did, the trees seemed to close in on me. Their branches hung low, almost like they were reaching out, trying to grab my car. I told myself it was just my imagination, trying to keep things light in my mind. After a few minutes, I saw the house up ahead. It was old, probably built in the 70s or earlier. There were no lights on outside, and the windows were dark, but I could just make out the number 128 on the mailbox. I pulled up the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires, and parked. I got out of the car, grabbed the pizza, and headed toward the front door. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. No crickets, no wind, just dead silence. The house was dimly lit inside with just a faint glow coming from a window near the front door. I knocked once and there was no answer. I knocked again, a bit harder this time, and then I heard it, a raspy voice from inside. "Come in," it said, barely above a whisper. "The door's open." Now this was definitely weird. I've had customers tell me to leave the pizza on the porch before, but never to come inside. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob. My instincts told me to just leave the pizza on the porch and get out of there, but then I thought about the tip. Late-night deliveries like this usually meant a decent tip, especially since the drive was so far out. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The place was dark, with just one dim lamp on in the corner of what seemed to be the living room. The air inside was stale, like the house hadn't been lived in for a long time. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed the walls were covered in deep scratch marks, like something or someone had clawed at them repeatedly. It gave me the chills, but I tried to stay focused. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I stepped further into the room, still holding the pizza box. There was a table in the center of the room with a stack of cash on it, more money than the pizza was worth, by a lot. Next to the money, there was a piece of paper with the words, "Take the money," and "Go" scribbled on it in shaky handwriting. The whole situation was screaming at me to get out, but curiosity got the better of me. I looked around the room, trying to figure out who I was supposed to be delivering this pizza to. There was a hallway leading further into the house, but it was pitch black down there and I didn't dare go any further. Then, I heard the voice again, this time much closer. "Take the money and go," it whispered right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't need to be told a third time. I grabbed the stack of cash, shoved it in my pocket, and bolted out the door, leaving the pizza on the table. I didn't even bother to close the door behind me. I just ran to my car, jumped in, and sped off down the driveway, the gravel spraying out from under my tires. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing after me. But the road behind me was empty. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road, where the streetlights started appearing again. My hands were shaking and I could barely keep the car steady. I couldn't believe what had just happened. When I got back to the pizza place, I parked the car and just sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath. I pulled the wad of cash out of my pocket and counted it. There had to be at least $500 there. Way more than I should have been paid for that delivery. My boss was still inside, cleaning up before closing, so I went in and told him about the delivery. He looked at me like I was crazy. "You went inside?" he asked, shaking his head. "You know we're not supposed to go into customers' houses, especially out in the middle of nowhere like that." I nodded, knowing I'd messed up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with that place. I asked him if he knew anything about the address, but he said it didn't sound familiar. I handed him the cash, and he gave me my share of the tip. I didn't tell him about the voice or the scratches on the walls. I figured he wouldn't believe me anyway. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about that house. Something just didn't sit right with me. I decided to do a little digging. I looked up the address online, trying to see if there was any history behind it, but nothing came up. Just an old property that hadn't been sold in decades. No news stories, no records of anyone living there, nothing. But then I found something strange. There was a post on a local forum from a few years back, from a guy talking about a similar experience at a different address. He was also a pizza delivery driver, and he'd been called out to a remote house late at night. When he got there, he found a stack of cash and a note telling him to take the money and go. He said he felt like he was being watched the entire time, and he never went back to that area again. Reading that sent chills down my spine. It was too similar to my experience to be a coincidence. I tried to put it out of my mind, but every time I close my eyes, I see that room. The deep scratches on the walls, the stack of cash, and the feeling that someone was right behind me, even though no one was there. I don't deliver to that area anymore. I even asked my boss to take me off the late-night shifts. He gave me a weird look but didn't ask questions. I think he could tell that whatever happened that night really messed me up. I still don't know what to make of it all. Was it some kind of prank? A setup? Or something else entirely? I keep telling myself it was just some lonely guy with too much money and a weird sense of humor. But deep down, I know there's more to it than that. It was a regular Friday night and the orders were coming in fast. Most of them were typical. A couple of pizzas, some sides, nothing too complicated. The last delivery of the night came in at around 11:30 p.m. The address was unfamiliar to me, and when I looked it up on the GPS it was a bit out of town, in a secluded area. I didn't think much of it. Just another delivery, I told myself. The drive out there was uneventful. The roads were mostly empty, and the further I went, the more isolated the area became. The houses were spread out, and streetlights were few and far between. After about 20 minutes of driving, I turned onto a narrow, winding road that led deeper into the woods. Finally, I spotted the house. It was old and run down, like it hadn't been taken care of in years. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. There was no car in the driveway, and no lights on inside. I double-checked the address. This was the place. I pulled up and parked in the driveway, grabbing the pizza from the passenger seat. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed how quiet everything was. No crickets, no wind, just silence. The kind that makes your skin crawl a little. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. After a few moments I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then I noticed the door was slightly ajar, just a crack, like it hadn't been closed all the way. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a little uneasy, but I figured maybe the customer was expecting me and had just left the door open. So I called out, "Hello, pizza delivery," but no one answered. Pushing the door open a bit more, I poked my head inside. "Hello?" I called again. The house was dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner of what looked like a living room. The place smelled old, like musty furniture that hadn't been aired out in years. I stepped inside, glancing around, but I didn't see anyone. The floor creaked under my feet and the silence felt even heavier now that I was inside. I was about to turn around and leave when I noticed a figure sitting in a recliner facing away from me, the chair pointed towards a blank TV screen. "Excuse me, sir?" I said, moving a little closer. The person in the chair didn't respond or move. I felt my heart start to race. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I took another step forward, trying to get a better look. The man's shoulders were slumped and he didn't seem to be breathing. I was getting seriously creeped out, but I figured he might be asleep or something. So I walked around to the front of the chair to get his attention. That's when he slowly turned his head towards me. I nearly dropped the pizza. The man's face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide open, staring at me with this twisted grin that made my stomach turn. His lips were chapped, and his skin looked dry, like it had been sitting under the sun for too long. "You need to leave," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but the urgency in it was clear. I didn't need to be told twice. I backed away, heart pounding, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. As I reached the door, I noticed a faint sound coming from somewhere deeper in the house. It was like a muffled cry or a whimper, but it was so faint I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. I bolted out of the house, slamming the door behind me, and ran to my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting them into the ignition and starting the engine. I peeled out of there as fast as I could, not caring about anything other than putting distance between me and that house. As I drove back, I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face, that grin, and his warning to leave. Something about the whole thing just felt wrong, like I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the guy was just messing with me, or maybe he was sick. But that didn't explain the other sound I'd heard. I got back to the pizzeria and handed the cash register the money from the delivery. My boss noticed I was shaken up and asked if everything was okay. I told him what happened, and he just shook his head saying, "Some people are just weird, man. Don't let it get to you." I tried to forget about it, but the whole night I couldn't stop thinking about that house and the man in the chair. The next morning I woke up to a bunch of missed calls and texts from my boss. He sounded frantic, telling me to turn on the news. I switched on the TV and there it was. A report about a house out in the woods, the same one I had been at the night before. They had found a body inside, a man who had been dead for over a day. The news anchor mentioned that he had been tied up and tortured before he died. My blood ran cold as I realized what they were saying. The man I saw in that chair was dead before I even got there. But that didn't make any sense. I saw him, he turned his head and spoke to me. The news went on to say that the real homeowner had been found tied up in the basement, alive but severely injured. How could the man in the chair have been dead when I saw him, and who was the guy who warned me to leave? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had, but no answers. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there, staring at the TV screen, feeling like I was losing my mind. I eventually went to the police to tell them what happened. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They probably thought I was just some scared delivery guy who freaked out over a creepy house. But I know what I saw, and I know that man spoke to me.